UNM political science professor Gabe Sanchez and KRQE political analyst joins us here in the KRQE News 13 digital studio once again to talk about politics, and this time the CD1 special election. Gabe, first of all, thanks so much for joining us again.
Hey, pleasure. Always a pleasure to talk with you. I hope everybody's staying safe and doing well out there.
Absolutely. Well, of course, as I mentioned, we always talk to you about politics. This time, it's in an off season. It's a rare special election. We've seen Congresswoman Deb Haaland be confirmed as the Secretary of Interior for the Biden administration. So first off, just to kind of set the stage here, what is the rarity and just how rare are these sort of special elections to have happening here in New Mexico, I suppose is the context.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting, right, to have this conversation because it is a rarity here in New Mexico. We now have at least closer assurance of who the candidates are going to be. We know the election is going to take place on June 1, so details are starting to sort out. Those of us who can think back to the late 1990s here in New Mexico might remember some precedent for these special elections. I think in this particular district, folks might not even remember this well. I had to dig into the research myself on this, but going back to, I believe, 1998, that's how Heather Wilson first ended up in this district. I think at that point in time, there was a vacancy, and she basically jumped into the seat back there in 98. And then another familiar name to folks paying attention out there, back in 1997, at that time, Representative Bill Richardson left his district in the 3rd Congressional District up north to take on, I think it was a UN ambassador post back at that time, which triggered a special election. So they had happened around here. It has happened in at least relatively recent memory in this district. But because it's pretty rare, especially for a lot of younger voters or voters that are relatively new to New Mexico, I think there was a bit of confusion, even some frustration among a lot of voters once they realized, wait a minute, we don't get to vote during this as a normal primary, and you really only had party elites on both sides of the aisle, right? A couple hundred folks essentially on both sides of the aisle, basically being able to pick who was going to be the nominee of the party. So you saw some frustration. In fact, even in the state legislative session, there were some attempts to reform or revise how you go about this process. So I think all of that is the context, right, in which we start to step into talking about the candidates and what might happen on June 1.
Yeah, and as you had mentioned there, Gabe, the people who are selecting these candidates, it is each major party's state central committee. For the Democrats, I believe it's 199 individuals, and these are sort of party members, people that work in the party directly. People, of course, can become involved in the party in pretty much any way, but there is a bit of privilege, I suppose, in being on the state's central committee. And in this case, yes, it's those state central committees that get to choose the candidate. In CD1, particularly, we've seen the Democratic control for a number of years, really, as you had mentioned, going back to the Heather Wilson era. The end of that was in 2008. She was making a bid for a U.S. Senate seat, but then lost in the Republican primary there. And the seat has been held by Democrats essentially since 2008. So I just wanted to, without even considering the candidates, I just wanted to really kind of ask the question. CD1, seen as entrenched Democrat territory at this point, what is the possibility that Democrats keep CD1 without even considering the candidates? Is this as hard of a seat to turn for Republicans as, say, CD3, the northern New Mexico seat for Congress that has only gone to a Republican one time in its existence? Is this kind of the same situation with CD1, that Democrats have a strong likelihood of keeping this seat?
That's what most of us, perceive. Even, we do our statistical modeling where we don't even have candidates, and this is generally perceived as a safe seat. I would probably handicap this at about 10 to 12% likelihood of a Democratic victory. And, some of us remember the good old days when this district was a key battleground, right? I mean, decided by some of the closest margins nationally, right? And this would actually generate a lot of national attention back in the Heather Wilson days. But a lot has changed since then, right? More folks are moving to the central cities across the United States. New Mexico's not unique in that regard. And you tend to have in urban areas Democratic advantages. This has also been redistricted. Right. And when it happened, I think since then in 2010, right, we've seen an increasing Democratic advantage. So if we think about this, right, in the context of the last couple of election cycles, I believe that Biden won this district by about 23 points in the last election cycle. I think it was like 60 to 37%. I believe that was the widest margin ever in this district. Yeah. Right. So I think for a lot of us, we kind of think of this as a safe Democratic seat. Congressman Holland was able to maintain this seat very comfortably, even without running any TV ads. Think about unheard of that is in the state of New Mexico. So I think there's a lot of reasons for Democrats to perceive this as a safe seat, but this is the key here. This is a special election, right? This is a rarity where you only have a couple of months from the time we're going to know who the candidates are to campaign and turn people out to vote. So I think in that environment, like we always like to say on these things, anything can happen. Yeah. And we've seen, particularly in this district, a lot of anythings have happened in the past. So I think it'll be a bit tighter than the 10, 12% margin. I think, candidate Moores on the Republican side can make this potentially more competitive. But I would anticipate, even before knowing who the candidates are, I've been talking about this on air a while back, that this should be a pretty safe seat for Democrats.
Well, of course, we did want to mention a little bit about what we know about the candidate picture at this time. We're recording this on March 31st, and the Democrats are in the middle of an interesting runoff race between either Antoinette Cedillo-Lopez or Melanie Stansberry, two current state lawmakers. To mention, as you had mentioned, State Senator Mark Moores, a Republican, he is running. He has picked up this sort of nomination for the Republican Party, and then you've got on the Libertarian Party, the other major party here in New Mexico, Chris Manning was confirmed in their state's recent sort of special convention to select, again, the person representing the party. So let's just say from the candidates right now, what should we know, without getting too much into each one of them yet, what should we know about this matchup from the outset? I thought you mentioned something interesting, is that candidate Moores may make this a little bit more competitive than perhaps the race has been in some of the recent years.
Yeah, let's talk about Moores on the front end. And I think there's some interesting context, like there always is, right, when we're talking about party politics. But most of us perceive that Moores was essentially recruited by the Republican Party to jump into this, primarily because one of the other candidates, I think Eddie Aragon, oversees a radio program, much more conservative, more in the Trump style of the Republican Party, and has been a vocal critic of Pierce and the Republican Party ever since he didn't get essentially the bid to run the state party. And I think there was a lot of speculation that if Aragon got the nomination, not only would he not win in the general election, but it could further splinter the Republican Party. And I think Moores, being more of a traditional candidate, a state senator from here in Albuquerque, has name recognition, popularity, more establishment, and connected to the state Republican Party, I think helps not only the short-term prospect of making this a bit tighter than it would be otherwise, but you don't have that elephant in the room, which could be, right, disaster for the Republican Party, or more difficulty, I think, solidifying the Republican base around not only these candidates, but bigger picture. So I think you've got that context coming into this. That I think is always like interesting when you're thinking about, especially a special election where essentially party elites have a lot more say in who's going to represent their party than in a traditional primary.
Another element to talk about, of course, are just the candidates individually with the Democrats. And I mentioned this unique situation that we're in right now as of when we're recording this, the Democrats having essentially a runoff between two candidates, Antoinette Cedillo-Lopez and Melanie Stansberry, Cedillo-Lopez being a state senator, Stansberry being a state representative, both of them having reached the state legislature in 2019. Cedillo-Lopez being a retired UNM law professor. She also is a name that is familiar to Democrat politics in the past because she ran in a crowded Democrat primary in June 2018. She came in third in that primary with 20% of the vote to Deb Haaland, who won that primary with 41%, and Damon Martinez in second place with 25% of the vote. So then that is against Stansberry, who, again, they're in this runoff here today. We've got Melanie Stansberry with 21% of the vote that happened in the Democrat Party's State Central Committee vote yesterday. She's a current state representative, as I mentioned, also been a consultant in issues related to land, water, and community issues, as she says, in New Mexico. She had a time working in D.C. on things. So between these two candidates, I do know that as well to note that Cedillo-Lopez got 37% of Tuesday's State Central Committee vote to Stansberry's 21, as I had mentioned earlier. It seems Cedillo Lopez has a bit of an edge here. And of course, she also ran in the 2018 primary, which sort of lends a little bit more maybe name recognition out there. But again, this is a party insider vote. So it's a little bit hard to tell which outcome this is trending. But if we just look at that initial vote, right now we see Cedillo Lopez with kind of that edge. Is there anything that you can kind of lend to tell us about each of these candidates and maybe which direction this might be going, Gabe?
Yeah, I mean, both of these women are incredibly, right, strong candidates. You look at their biographical dynamics, right? They both have served in elected office. So I think they were among the top tier of candidates on the Democratic side from the giddy up in this. And I think it's trending exactly how most of us thought it would, with Cedillo Lopez perceived to be probably the front runner. And, you know, seeing it's a pretty commanding lead through the first heat, right, of 16%. But keep in mind how a lot of this works is as the candidates are speaking, right, to this 199 folks, right, they're often saying things like, hey, if I'm not your first candidate, let me campaign to be your second candidate. Really knowing if this didn't get 50 plus 1%, we were going to be in a runoff selection. And so I think a lot of it is dependent on whether Stansberry can solidify some of those folks that might not have been with her as her primary first candidate, but hey, right, your first candidate's no longer in this anymore. Let me convince you I'm the best candidate for this district. And I think a lot of it is really how they project their electability, not only in this special election, but the longer term, right? Why should I represent this party and keep this seat in Democratic hands for the long term? And I think Cedillo Lopez, for a couple of reasons, right, for me, still is the front runner. One is she's got the experience of running in a primary for this particular district. And what that does is once you jump into that fray, you've got to find campaign managers. You've got to start thinking about raising national money. You've got to do all these things, right, that you don't know anything about unless you've been a candidate in that seat. And so she has a little bit of experience. She's going to have some networks and relationships to be able to raise money, all of those things that bode well for her. And I also think that Democrats, more so than Republicans, think deeply about what we refer to as descriptive politics. Right. And everybody's been talking about the fact that you've got a Native American woman vacating the seat. Should there be another elected official of color representing this district? And I think there's a lot of, especially these days, pressure on Democrats to think about these things. And obviously, Cedillo Lopez being Hispanic female, that might matter a bit. Right. And so all those things start to add up and might actually swing things in Cedillo Lopez's way. That being said, Stansberry has run a very, very strong campaign. I think she did a bit better than I thought she would through the first round. And so anything could happen, particularly when you're trying to solidify, right, some of these folks and maybe get some offline endorsements from some of the candidates who didn't emerge as the top two. Maybe they swing support towards Stansberry. So anything could happen, but I still think it's Cedillo Lopez's race here. And I would not be surprised if we hear that she gets over the 50% mark today.
One of the things that you had mentioned there was the idea of carrying this seat for years to come, and keeping in mind that we've also said many times anything can happen. It's a little bit tough to picture. You know, does this mean that whoever wins here would definitely be the only person maybe for the party in the primary in the next election and the next election? So, question being, if Cedillo Lopez or if Stansberry wins this, do you expect any challengers in the next primary that might come up?
Yeah, I would expect some challengers. Whether or not that it'll be a hard fought race, that's to be determined. But all of us know, right? All of us armchair quarterbacks when it comes to politics know the time to try to catch an incumbent is early, right? And so coming off of this, where you haven't had a full-blown campaign, you haven't had strong name recognition, that would be the time, if you were thinking about being a member of Congress on the Democratic side from the Albuquerque area, this would be the time to do it. Once a candidate gets through one full election cycle as an incumbent, it's very, very hard, unless they choose not to rerun, right? It's very hard to unseat them. So I think I would expect if there's going to be a strong challenge, right, it will happen early. And I will say there were a number of really interesting, dynamic candidates who decided this was not the right context because they weren't going to be making an argument to voters, and maybe they don't have the relationship with party insiders, et cetera, that decided they weren't going to jump in. But once you already investigate the likelihood of pulling this out and raising money, you might be saying, well, hey, I'll just catch this when it's open to voters in a more traditional election format.
Interesting. Well, I know we did address the Republicans candidate, Mark Moore, Senator Mark Moores, but just to jump in back to his candidacy just briefly here, to ask you in a kind of very direct way, does he have a shot here? It seems that he is at least in terms of performance, he has done very well in Albuquerque, considering that Albuquerque has lost many Republican state senators, especially in the last election. So the just basic question I've got for you, does Senator Mark Moores as the Republican candidate have a shot here against either one of these Democrat challengers?
You know, the direct answer is you always have a puncher's chance, to use a sports metaphor. But I would not, if I was a betting man, which I'm not, I would not put a lot of money on Moores just because of the overall electoral context, right, that we're talking about. I think he's an incredibly strong candidate and he will make this interesting. But let's name a couple of things that we didn't talk so much about, right? So we said Biden carried this district very heavily, right? In that electoral environment, even Moores had a rough go of it. I think he only carried his race by 6 percentage points. I think it was like 53-47. So that's pretty tight, right? So I think you just got an environment in which it's perceived, right, that you've got huge Democratic advantage. I think there's like 85,000 more registered Democrats in the district as of late. So you've just got all these prevailing winds going with Democrats. But there's some interesting dynamics here. One is, right, you've got these potential spoilers, right? You've got a Libertarian candidate, right, that potentially could steal some votes from the Democrat. I hear that Aubrey Dunn is trying to get signatures to run as potentially an independent. You start adding these other variables into the mix, right, and that could steal a few percentage points here, a few percentage points there. Those things could matter. I did not even know this until I was doing my research to prepare for this. Moores has Hispanic heritage in his background. I don't often hear him talking about that, right? But if he decides, you know what, on my mother's side, I do have Hispanic ancestry, and he markets himself that way, you know, playing these racial identity issues, again, 1 percentage point, 2 percentage points, all those things could add up to make this different. And keep in mind, right, in an off cycle election like this, right, June 1, couple months to campaign, right? A lot of people aren't paying close attention to this, right? You could actually mobilize enough Republicans, right, who might actually be a little frustrated with too much swing towards the Democratic Party. Maybe some moderate Democrats decide, and New Mexicans do this often, you know what, Democrats are just taking too much power right now. Maybe it's good for the state to have somebody on the Republican side of things. I have seen that happen many times in the state of New Mexico. So it gives Moores, right, again, that puncher's chance. But if I were to handicap this, I just don't see enough there for him to be able to pull this out.
Interesting. And you had mentioned the chance of a possible spoiler candidate. We should also mention third major party in New Mexico, the Libertarian Party. Chris Manning is there. It was selected by the Libertarian Party State Central Committee as their candidate. Does he have a chance for a spoiler style vote here? His name is certainly not been out there as much as when you consider other spoiler candidates in maybe more national races, but there's always a chance. And I wanted to ask you that. Is the Libertarian candidate on the ballot a chance for a spoiler vote here?
There's definitely a chance, right? I was doing some research on this during the legislative session for a couple of bills that were aimed at strengthening, you know, third-party candidates and third-party voters. We've actually seen a significant increase in third-party oriented voters, not just here in Albuquerque, but statewide. So a lot of these things come down to whether or not the Libertarian candidate will have enough money in the war chest to really market themselves well, mobilize voters, right? Do all those things that you have to do, again, in only 2 months. And so, you know, things can happen, but I don't anticipate it being a huge dynamic. And you also, right, have to think about, well, where would a Libertarian steal votes from? Is it going to come from the Democratic base, the Republican base? Typically, these things might even wash out. But, you know, a lot's going to depend on whether or not money comes in to actually campaign and get your name out there.
And speaking of campaign, we know, again, we've talked about how little time there is between now, here's March 31st, and June 1st, the date of the special election. Is there any particular type of advertising that people should expect, voters should expect to see over the next few weeks? It seems like with just a short amount of time, you kind of maybe pick one thing that you put all your money into. But to ask you, is there any particular type of advertising that people should expect or see more of over these next few weeks?
We'll see, like we always do, an increasing number of campaign ads on television, right? Especially, it looks like Moores has about $250,000. Multi-million dollar question in this race is, will Moores generate enough attention nationally, right? That maybe some Republican money comes in from out of state that perceives maybe they could steal this seat, right? With money comes the ability to advertise on TV. I would expect Cedillo Lopez to be able to raise enough money to really market and flood the TV market here. But beyond that, it's digital, right? You only got a couple of months. So who's got the better ground game? Who's got the stronger list of actual voters, right? And email addresses and the WhatsApp feeds and everything else to flood people digitally, because it happens fast, right? And it's inexpensive. I would expect a lot of this to happen digitally. And another really important context is, right, we're not out of the pandemic yet. So how comfortable will the candidates feel about trying to do any in-person events? How comfortable would they feel of doing any in-person door knocking? And what I find really, really intriguing about this race is I would anticipate Moore's on the Republican side of this really trying to make this a statewide election where they essentially try to run on a couple of themes. Number one, crime, right? And really focus and hit hard on really the rising crime rates here in Albuquerque, et cetera. And probably bigger issue is trying to make this a race against the governor, right? Can they articulate that, hey, the governor's put us in full lockdown, that's had economic consequences, closing down of schools, things that Moores has already talked about being a central part of his campaign. And I could see a really interesting dynamic, which is what we've seen nationally, Republican candidates being more open to campaigning in person and doing events. And if that gets into a little bit of a firework match between the governor saying you're violating the orders and Moores saying you're the problem, right? That could actually generate a lot of enthusiasm among Republicans who just might not be happy with the overall context. And who do they blame in those situations? The governor. So it's an interesting dynamic that I think could make this a little intriguing, especially if Moores decides to do anything in person or any events, you know, given that we still got the backdrop of the pandemic to worry about.
Well, very interesting, and I think it should be a really exciting and quick few months here between the now where we're at finalizing the candidates and June 1st special election. Gabe, anything else you'd want to let people know about this situation happening here and what's shaping up?
You know, the only thing I think we didn't talk about is, at least in recent memory, right, this has not been a seat that candidates have been interested in staying in for the long term. I would think about this, at least in recent memory, as being somewhat of a jumping off point to quote unquote bigger and better things, right? You've got multiple candidates who have decided, I'm going to make a run at a U.S. Senate seat, and have vacated the seat on both sides of the aisle, right? Heather Wilson has done that. We've seen Heinrich do that, right? So it's on that side of it. And obviously Michelle Lujan Grisham vacating the seat to make a run at governor. So I think a question is, right, is this going to be another jumping off point for any of these candidates? Will they stay here long enough to establish name recognition and make a run at other things? Or will this be somebody who decides to make a long run at this, which is always good for New Mexico because Congress is a seniority-based system. We want somebody to stay in there long enough to get the great committee assignments and be able to bring resources back to the state. So I think that's a big picture question beyond who wins this. Will this be somebody we're talking about for some time, or will it be one or two election cycles and then we're talking about them vacating and opening the seat back up again?
Wow. Well, Gabe, we appreciate your analysis. Thanks again for joining us here in the KRQE Digital Studio, and we will wait and see what happens on June 1st. Thanks again, Gabe.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Everybody stay healthy out there.